How are you guys doing? Today is Tuesday, December 29th, 2020 out here in this quarantine. I'm James Sims, and for this episode of The Elite, I'm going to go through all the basketball players in the world that I have labeled elite as players that stand out amongst players that amongst their contemporaries, amongst their peers in the league, and of course players that have established themselves as current grades and future all-timers when it comes down to it at the end of the day. I'm going to go through I'm going to go through both conferences, and I'm going to list the individual players from each team, and I'm going to just kind of build it out just to kind of show you where the elite powers are distributed in the NBA. Of course, the NBA is a team with a salary cap, so the best players in the league are kind of dispersed. And because the NBA, I think, is the top league of basketball, kind of hands down, all of the best players in the world are either playing in the NBA or they're slated to be playing in the NBA. So, I mean, I think that's also very convenient with the sport. That's very convenient with the sport of basketball. And without further ado, I'm going to jump right into it. So the first prospect that I have on my list is Imani Bates. He's the only basketball prospect that is currently not a member of an NBA organization that I would consider elite. He's 16 years old. He was born in 2004, and as a sophomore in high school, he was labeled the Gatorade's Men Basketball Player of the Year, rated as the best player regardless of class over juniors and seniors, which is two whole classes of high schoolers, which should show you that when Imani Bates gets to the NBA or when he starts inflicting his damage, his pain, it's going to be very noticeable just to see how elite and very individually dynamic this one player is. So jumping into the Eastern Conference, I'm going to start in Canada because I feel like that's a very easy thing to do. Starting with the Toronto Raptors, Kyle Lowry, their 34-year-old point guard out of Villanova, I believe is still elite because he's been a very consistent all-star over the last couple of years, and he has a championship under his belt as one of the leading contributors to his team. And along the same lines, I would say Pascal Siakam, their 26-year-old power forward from Texas. He would eventually end up, I think he is also an elite player as well. He was named an all-star starter. He was named an all-star for the second time in his career, and he's also another player from the Toronto Raptors that was a major contributor in them making it to and eventually winning the finals. And he's shown that he can be a lot better. And this is a player that went on from being like the D-League MVP to being a prime contributor on one of the best teams in the NBA. So I think just by that logic, I believe he deserves to be recognized as an elite player. So now jumping out to Boston, because I think that with the Boston Celtics, their point guard, Kemba Walker, their 30-year-old point guard from UConn, I believe is still one of the premier elite NBA players. He's made like the last 4 or 5 All-Star games while being one of the biggest players for Charlotte. He went to Boston and he immediately became a big part of a team that went pretty deep into the playoffs. Kemba Walker is very important to this team, and considering he's been the same player since his elite college run at UConn, I think it's very fair to list Kemba Walker as one of the elite players in the NBA. And then alongside him, I think Jason Tatum, the 22-year-old forward who was born in 98 out of Duke, considering he just got signed to to the max extension after multiple instances in the playoffs where he's shown late-game heroics despite being one of the league's youngest stars. I think just because of that alone, Jason Tatum deserves to be recognized as one of the best players in the league. I didn't recognize any players from the New York Knicks at all, but from the 76ers, I said that Joel Embiid, their 26-year-old elite center, deserves to be recognized as elite. He's one of the league's best scorers, one of the league's most imposing defensive players, and he's been named an all-star starter the last couple of years. So when healthy, he can prove that he's one of the league's best centers. A very tough position to be incredibly dominant in, but Joel Embiid finds a way. And alongside him, I'd say their 24-year-old point guard from Australia, Ben Simmons, is also elite. He's been named to the last 3 All-Star games, and he was named to the first-team All-Defense after leading the entire league in steals, after averaging basically 16 points, 8 rebounds, and 8 assists for the 3rd year in a row. And he's a big part of a team that has made the playoffs every single year that he's been in the league. So, of course, Ben Simmons is an elite player by those, I think by those standpoints. And then last but not least, for the Brooklyn Nets, I would start off with their GOATed small forward from Texas or from Virginia, Kevin Durant. At 31 years old, he is a two-time champion. He is a one-time MVP. He's made a double-digit amount of All-Star games, and now that he's on Brooklyn, he's made Brooklyn an immediate title contender. That's enough to say that Kevin Durant is not only elite, but he is a goated. He's one of the greatest players to ever play the game, and he's still in his prime. And then alongside him, it is their 28-year-old point guard from Duke, Kyrie Irving. Who I think this year is showing that he's one of the league's best players. He's in his age 28 season, so I have no reason to deny that he's going to put up a statistically amazing season. And let's not forget that Kyrie Irving is a champion, and he played a big part in the Cavaliers winning that championship in 2016. He hasn't shown any signs of slowing down. He's just been very injury-prone in the past. But I still think if you overlook a lot of that, Kyrie Irving is one of the best players in the NBA. And because of that, he still deserves to be recognized as one of the most elite players in the NBA. Going to the Central, I don't think any players from the Bulls or the Pacers should be recognized as elite. But I do think from the Pistons, Blake Griffin deserves to be recognized as elite. He's been named an all-star 5 or 6 years that he's been in the league. His last full season in Detroit, he averaged 25 points a game and was actually named an all-star. I think it's very tough for him to get situated in a completely new city, and he's had his injury problems that he's been dealing with. But when Blake Griffin plays, he proves to be a very individually dominant and a very impactful player. So I think Blake Griffin, and also he also has 5, 6 All-Star appearances to lean his back on. Blake Griffin is one of the most elite. He is an elite player in the NBA, and even though he's in Detroit, he can still make things happen in that city. I mean, he's still a very elite player that I believe a lot in. I don't think any players from the Cavaliers are particularly elite. But I do think that Giannis Antetokounmpo, the reigning back-to-back MVP and 26-year-old small forward for the Milwaukee Bucks, should be considered elite. Any player that wins the MVP multiple times, I think he's already going to be recognized as one of the greatest players in the sport. But so far under his belt, he only has the MVPs, and he still has to win in the playoffs, but he's still 26. He has an amazing career ahead of him, and considering he was voted the best player in the NBA the last 2 years, it would be silly for me to not recognize Giannis Antetokounmpo as one of the best players in the NBA. Going to the South, starting with the Washington Wizards, I would say Russell Westbrook, the 32-year-old point guard who just got moved to the Wizards, is still recognized. I think he should still be recognized as elite. This is the only player in NBA history to go 3 straight seasons averaging a triple-double, and in his last season, he was one of the biggest contributors for a Houston Rockets team that went very deep in the playoffs, and they ended up losing to the eventual champions, the Los Angeles Lakers. Now it's a new change of scenery, and I think Russell Westbrook is starting to. I think he's going to enjoy his time in D.C. for as long as he is there. And with the Washington Wizards moving forward, I think that they can lean on Russell Westbrook being a very important player on their team and on their roster for future years. And alongside him, I'd say that Bradley Beal, their 27-year-old shooting guard out of Florida, is also elite. Even though he wasn't named an All-Star last year, he averaged 30 points a game. I think he's the only 30-point scorer in NBA history to not be named to an All-Star game. But just in addition to that, Bradley Beal should be recognized because he's an elite player in more ways than scoring, and I think that the Wizards are going to be a lot better of a team now that they have Russell Westbrook and now that Bradley Beal is going to be completely healthy for this year. So I think it's going to be that tandem in Washington. And jumping to Atlanta very quickly, jumping to the Hornets because I'm going to go through Charlotte. I say that the only elite player from this most recent draft class is LaMelo Ball, the 19-year-old point guard for the Hornets. He isn't necessarily starting yet, but I'd say his path to get to the NBA is a very wild one, considering his freshman year at high school, he went to Chino Hills, where he was a part of the best high school basketball team ever. One of the best high school basketball teams ever, including Onyeka Okongwu, who was drafted in that same draft to the Hawks, and Lonzo Ball and LiAngelo. He ended up traveling around the country and then he eventually got drafted to the Hornets. I think he's a very multifaceted offensive player, and he can get a lot going. His defense will come eventually, but he is a very gifted offensive player, and I think that he's a player that will get the Hornets He will get the Hornets franchise up and running as soon as he gets everything going there. He hasn't proven anything yet in the NBA, but I think up until now, LaMelo Ball has proven that he is one of the elite players he is one of the elite basketball players in the world, especially when it comes to the NBA. We have to see what he does in 2021, but I have all faith that LaMelo Ball will prove to be elite this year. Jumping to the Atlanta Hawks, the only player from the Atlanta Hawks that I would classify as elite is their 21-year-old point guard out of Oklahoma, Trae Young. His second year in the league, he averaged 29 points and 9 assists as he was named an all-star starter in his second year alongside Luka Doncic. Just for being that young and being that prolific, even though he's regarded as the worst defensive player, his offensive impact does a lot for this Atlanta Hawks team, and considering they're building an entirely new core around him, I can't wait to see what Trae Young has in store for him in Atlanta. And considering he's only 21, he has at least a decade of great basketball left. I'm jumping to Florida. I would say there's no players on the Orlando Magic that I would register as elite. But for the Miami Heat, first I would start off with their 31-year-old small forward, Jimmy Butler out of Marquette, who ended up putting up one of the best performances in a losing performance in the NBA Finals against the Los Angeles Lakers this year. He was very instrumental, and I would say he was the best player in helping lead the Miami Heat through the East, through the quarantine into the NBA Finals. And Jimmy Butler, he's a perennial all-star, and I think he finally deserves the respect that he's been looking for his entire career. And alongside him, I'd say the Miami Heat's 23-year-old center out of Kentucky, Bam Adebayo, deserves to be recognized as well. He was a big contributor in the Heat making the playoffs, and in his third season in the NBA, he was named to his first All-Star game after averaging 15 points and 10 rebounds. Just showing how, as a player who could be looked at as undersized, he can be a very impactful player. And the Miami Heat moving forward, I think I'll be very comfortable with the Miami Heat this year in 2021, as long as they have Jimmy Butler and Bam Adebayo on their roster. So those are all the teams in the East. Taking you out west just to show you what the West is looking like, starting in the Southwest Division, starting with the Pelicans. I think that their 23-year-old small forward out of Duke, Brandon Ingram, deserves to be recognized as elite. He was named the NBA's most improved player as he averaged 22, 23 points a game, and he went on to be named to his first All-Star game in his career. So, of course, it was a big season, especially after getting moved from Los Angeles for Anthony Davis. He was named an All-Star his first year in New Orleans, and I think his career could most definitely blossom in that city, and he's only 23, so he has a lot of years ahead of him. Alongside him, I think their 20-year-old power forward and the number one pick in the 2019 NBA draft, Zion Williamson, should definitely be registered as should be. I think he's definitely an elite basketball player, considering his amazing one-and-done season at Duke, coupled with the fact that in 24 games in the NBA, he averaged over 20 points a game. He is the only teenager to have 10 straight games where he scored 20 points in the NBA, which is a very tough feat to do. So I think with that said, there's a lot of good basketball ahead of Zion Williamson, and considering he's only 20 years old and he's already established, I think is a no-brainer for being an elite player. So, of course, I'm going to keep Zion Williamson here just because I think it's the fair thing to do. From the Memphis Grizzlies, I believe their 20-year-old point guard, John Morant, who did end up injuring his leg today. I still think he's an elite point guard. He won the Rookie of the Year for 2019 after putting up an amazing year where the Memphis Grizzlies almost made the playoffs. They made it to the play-in series where they eventually lost to the Trailblazers. But John Morant was a very big part in them making it there. He's only 20 years old. He plays point guard incredibly well. And, he's played incredible. He was an elite player before he got there. And I think with the way the Grizzlies team is forming around him, I think John Morant is another player that has a lot of good basketball ahead of him. And considering he's only 20, his career is going to be a very fun career to watch from beginning to end. I think I don't think anyone from the San Antonio Spurs is particularly elite. But in jumping to the Mavericks, I think that Luka Doncic, their 21-year-old shooting guard from Slovenia, I think he's one of the I think he's one of the most elite players in the league. He's only 21 years old, and he was named to the first team All NBA after being named an All-Star. Started for the first time in his career, and averaging like 28, 9, and 9. So I mean, he's putting up incredible numbers. And he led the Dallas Mavericks to the playoffs, where he put up big 40-point outings in the playoffs, but it just simply wasn't enough. But I think from that Dallas Mavericks team, Luka Doncic deserves to be recognized as the elite player from that team. And finishing out the state of Texas, first off, I think James Harden for the Houston Rockets, I think he deserves to be recognized as elite. As for the last 2 full NBA seasons, he led the league in scoring. He's leading the league in scoring right now through like 1 game. But there's no doubt in my mind that he could do it again. He's one of the few players in NBA history that's averaged over 30 points a game without really busting a sweat. So, of course, he's one of the best players in the league. He's an 8-time All-Star up until this point. He's the league's leading scorer through the 2010s decade, through the last decade of the NBA. And I think the only thing that he's missing is championship hardware. But with that said, James Harden definitely deserves to be recognized as one of the elites. And for the Rockets, their 30-year-old point guard out of Kentucky, John Wall, who they just recently acquired from Washington, I think is also elite. In his last few seasons in the NBA, he was a perennial all-star, averaging double-digit assists alongside 20-ish points a game. I think that when John Wall is fully healthy, he can make a team a lot better, and he's a very good defensive stopper. I think going into 2021, I think in the games that he's healthy for, he can prove to be very helpful for this Houston Rockets team. And I think the Houston Rockets are going to be very glad that they picked up. I think they're going to be very glad that they picked up John Wall at the end of the day. So jumping out to the Northwest, starting with the Timberwolves, I think that Karl-Anthony Towns should be recognized as an elite center for that team. He's been putting up monstrous numbers, 20 and 10, pretty easily since he's came in the league. He's one of the few players you can almost guarantee is going to give you 20 and 10 every single night. He shoots incredibly well from outside on 3, and he also won a college championship. The only thing that's missing is a playoff run for the Timberwolves, but I think Karl-Anthony Towns as an individual center, for what he's done through the league, I think he's done enough to establish himself as elite. And with this Timberwolves core forming around him and him being the central piece, I think he is definitely the player that can lead the Timberwolves into the next stage of their franchise. And alongside him, I think that their 24-year-old point guard, D'Angelo Russell, is elite as well. I say D'Angelo Russell, his last full season in the NBA where he played for one team, he led the Brooklyn Nets into the playoffs. A Brooklyn Nets team that kind of had no business being in the playoffs without him. Last year, he started with the Golden State Warriors and eventually ended up on the Minnesota Timberwolves. And now that he is on the same team as Karl-Anthony Towns, and they added Anthony Edwards to that young core, and just like I said, I like how this Timberwolves core is growing. I think D'Angelo Russell at 24 years old is already an elite player, and he has his best years of playoff basketball definitely ahead of him. He's continuing in that division. I didn't list anyone from the OKC Thunder, but from the Denver Nuggets, I listed their center, Nikola Jokic, who deserves to be recognized as one of the best centers in the league. So far in the NBA, he has 42 points through his first 3 games. The only other players to do that in NBA history are all guards. He is a constant threat for a triple-double, and the Nuggets ended up making it to the Western Conference Finals past the Clippers, and I think Nikola Jokic was their best player and the biggest part of them getting there. And he's been named to the first team All-NBA at center a couple times. So, and he's only 25, so he has his best years ahead of him. He doesn't rely much on his athleticism, so he has a good amount of just basketball left. I think Nikola Jokic deserves to be recognized as one of the best players in the league, especially at his position. And alongside him, their 23-year-old point guard out of Kentucky, Jamal Murray, I think definitely deserves to be recognized as elite, especially following his playoff performance. I think before his playoff performances, I would say that he was really good. But of course, his back and forth with Donovan Mitchell in the first round, coupled with their stellar performances over the Los Angeles Clippers and them eventually losing to the Lakers, I think it was enough to paint Jamal Murray, to push him over the threshold of being an elite player to the point where there's no way of going back once you're Jamal Murray. If you can score 40 points on the Jazz and on like the Lakers and on the Clippers, then you can definitely be an elite player in the NBA. And Jamal Murray is a player that I'm definitely elevating to this status because of his stellar performances in the playoffs. And then for the Portland Trailblazers, I said that Damian Lillard, their 30-year-old point guard, should be recognized as elite. He's been named to the first-team All-NBA. He's been an All-NBA player for the last couple of years. Just looking into last year, he was a very big part of the Trailblazers, finishing 8th in the West. He was the bubble MVP following the end of it. Devin Booker helped lead a team to 8-0 in the bubble, and Damian Lillard still won the MVP of the bubble, which is to show you how good he is. They even ended up beating the Lakers a game in their very first game of the series. I just think the whole problem with Damian Lillard is that he's on the wrong team. You can make a very solid argument that he's the best point guard in basketball right now, but as long as he's on the Trailblazers, he's not going to do much. But as an individual player, I think it's very fair to say that Damian Lillard definitely stands apart from the other players in the NBA as one of the NBA's premier elite players. And then continuing in that division, for the Utah Jazz, I think that their center, Rudy Gobert, deserves to be recognized as elite. He's been a one-time All-Star, but he's been a multiple-time Defensive Player of the Year. He almost won it this year over Giannis. He would have won it for the third year in a row had he won it. I think just being the league's most imposing defensive player is, I think that's enough to warrant elite status. And even though he was the player that spread coronavirus to the rest of the league, Rudy Gobert is still feared by many in the NBA and gives a lot of people nightmares if they were to face up against him, because just from his ability to play amazing and stellar defense to make the Jazz that much better. He's a very impactful individual player for someone that doesn't score a lot of points. And then alongside him, the Utah Jazz's 24-year-old shooting guard Donovan Mitchell deserves to be recognized as elite as well. After putting up amazing performances in the playoffs, averaging 23 points in the season and making his first All-Star game, Donovan Mitchell is just he's on the cusp of stardom, and I think he's just gotten started. And I don't think there's any signs of Donovan Mitchell slowing down anytime in the future. So I believe Donovan Mitchell deserves to be recognized as elite alongside his peers, just for being so good, for being that good at such a young age. And then jumping out to the Pacific Division, starting off with the Suns. At 35 years old, I think that point guard Chris Paul deserves to be recognized as elite. The Oklahoma City Thunder finished with the fifth best record in the West. Chris Paul was their only All-Star. He's been named to a double-digit amount of All-Star games, being recognized as one of the league's best offensive and defensive players. And they're going to add him onto the Suns team. So I think that the addition of Chris Paul to this team could end up making the Suns a playoff team, because Chris Paul is just that individually dynamic as one player, despite the fact that he is 35 years old. And then alongside him, 11 years younger than him, is their shooting guard, Devin Booker, out of Kentucky, who in his second year in the league finished with 70 points in a game. Same player. I think that any night when Devin Booker has the ball, he's definitely a threat to score 20, 30 points. He helped the Suns finish 8-0 in the bubble, even though they didn't make the playoffs. They got very, very close, but Devin Booker was the biggest part of that. He's a big-time scorer, and he was also named to his first All-Star game after Damian Lillard was listed as a reserve, so he's officially an all-star in the eyes of the NBA. And considering he's only 24, he has so many good years ahead of him left. So I'm definitely looking forward to the career that Devin Booker has in store for him. Jumping out to California, because of course there's 4 whole teams in California. For the Warriors, their 32-year-old point guard, Steph Curry, I believe deserves to be recognized as one of the GOATs in the NBA. There is an argument of Steph Curry being the best point guard ever. I think it's undisputed that he's one of the best NBA players to ever live. He's a 3-time champion. He is a 2-time season MVP. He's the first-time unanimous MVP ever. He's a 50-40-90 player. He and Klay Thompson are the only players to score 200 3-pointers in 6 consecutive seasons in the NBA. And I think Stephen Curry alongside Klay Thompson, because Klay Thompson is elite as well. Their 30-year-old shooting guard out of Washington State. Both players have won 3 chips, and both can be and both are recognized as 2 of the greatest shooters the sport has ever seen. Klay Thompson and Steph Curry, I think, are a dynamic duo. And whenever these 2 teams are playing in the playoffs, the Warriors are most definitely a team to be feared, which is why I believe Klay Thompson and Steph Curry both deserve to be recognized on this list. I didn't recognize anybody on the Sacramento Kings, but from the Los Angeles Clippers, I recognized, first, I'm going to get to Paul George, the 30-year-old small forward from San Diego, or from Fresno State. I was gonna get this. He's from LA. His first season joining the Clippers after being first team All NBA on the Thunder. He helped the Clippers finish with the second best record in the West. But then Paul George would end up he would end up not showing up in the playoffs like people would expect him to. Paul George has been incredibly amazing in the regular season, but he's kind of made a career out of not really disappearing in the playoffs, but not performing at the level that he would normally perform at. He would perform at that level in the playoffs. But, of course, when Paul George is on, he's one of the best players in the league, a definite threat to go off for 30 points in a night, and he's one of the reasons why the Clippers are so dominant as is. But there's just a good amount missing. And then alongside him, the 29-year-old small forward from San Diego State, Kawhi Leonard, I think deserves to be recognized as a GOAT in this game. He won a championship with the San Antonio Spurs when they beat the Miami Heat, and he was the Finals MVP. And then he also won a championship with the Toronto Raptors, the only season he played in Toronto as their best player. The last championship before LeBron won was won by him, and the Finals MVP was won by Kawhi. So even though they lost in the Western Conference Finals, that doesn't take away from the fact that Kawhi Leonard has a resume that is pretty unmatched in the NBA. And when you consider how good he is, and you consider very few players are that dominant from beginning to end of a regular season, including the playoffs, that just shows you how amazing Kawhi Leonard is. The fact that he's already listed as a GOAT on my list, and he's not even 30 years old. And then last but not least, jumping to the world champion, the Los Angeles Lakers. Their power forward, Anthony Davis, definitely deserves to be recognized. The 27-year-old out of Kentucky. In this last season, he was traded from the Pelicans to Los Angeles, basically for the Lakers' young core and some draft picks. But immediately that would prove to be very vital, as Anthony Davis would put up an amazing season, giving him MVP votes, and he would finish second in the Defensive Player of the Year voting to Giannis Antetokounmpo. And also this year, Anthony Davis was the second best player on the best team in the league that powered through COVID and was able to get the championships for 2020. And just based off the decision that Anthony Davis made to join the Los Angeles Lakers in the summer of 2019, it was a very important one, as the only difference between a year ago and now is that he has a championship now. He wouldn't have won a championship in New Orleans. He made the move to New Orleans, made the gamble on himself, and the Lakers were able to win a championship with him being their second best player. And the only player he could be second best player to was LeBron James. He will be 36 tomorrow. The 35-year-old small forward playing for the Los Angeles Lakers. Of course, he's a GOAT, because to me and to many fans that have watched, he's the best basketball player that has ever played. As of right now, you can make a very solid argument that he's still the best player in the league at 36. So, I mean, that's enough, you got to say, for the dude to be elite. His second year with the Lakers, after missing the playoffs for the first time in a long time, he eventually makes the playoffs with COVID and everything going on. They beat the Trailblazers in 5 the first round. They beat the Rockets in 5 in the second round. They beat the Nuggets in 5 in the third round in the Western Conference Finals, and they ended up beating the Heat in 6. And LeBron James would end up winning his 4th championship, his 4th Finals MVP. And this is the 3rd team he'd win the Finals MVP with. He is the only NBA player to ever do so, and this is like only a couple months ago. But with that said, I think these are all of the elite basketball players in the NBA. I think the only player not in the NBA that should be listed as elite is Imani Bates. But every other player, I believe, has their reason, and once their birthdays, and once it hits their birthdays, I'm going to do a profile on them. But for now, I want to thank everyone once again for listening to all 30 minutes of this piece. Once again, it is Tuesday, December 29th, 2020. I'm James Sims, and these are all the players that I think should be recognized for the year of 2021 as being elite within the sport of basketball. Hopefully next year this list will change. I'll probably add a few. I'll probably drop a few. But as of right now, this is the list that I am very certain of and I'm very proud of. With that said, I want to thank you once again for listening to my piece. Peace out. I'll catch you tomorrow.